Between 1952 and 1978, the Sacred Heart Baptist Church of Mobile, Alabama, claimed 166 souls through baptism in the Tensas River, and all 166 vanished without trace. The muddy waters of the Tensas Delta have always been treacherous, but locals knew to respect the currents. What they didn't know was that Pastor William Harris had been using those same waters for something far more sinister than spiritual cleansing. The church records discovered in 1979, sealed in waterproof containers buried beneath the baptismal platform, contained meticulous documentation of each ceremony. Names, dates, weights, times of submersion. But most disturbing were the marginalia, cryptic notes about resistance levels, optimal depth, and disposal protocol. The final entry, dated September 15, 1978, simply read, "The river grows hungry. We must feed it properly." The institution's reputation. The Sacred Heart Baptist Church stood like a monument to unwavering faith on the banks of the Tensas River, 30 miles north of Mobile, Alabama. Built in 1923 with donations from the region's timber barons, its white clapboard exterior and towering steeple dominated the small community of Stockton. For nearly 3 decades, it served as the spiritual cornerstone for hundreds of families scattered across the rural Delta region. Pastor William Harris arrived in 1950, a charismatic preacher in his early 40s with credentials from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. His sermons drew crowds from as far as Montgomery, and his reputation for total immersion baptisms in the Tensas River became legendary throughout. Unlike other churches that used baptismal pools or shallow creek beds, Harris insisted that true salvation required complete submersion in the living waters of God's creation. The church's congregation swelled under Harris's leadership. By 1952, Sacred Heart Baptist had grown from 89 members to over 400, making it one of the largest rural congregations in the state. Harris's wife, Dorothy, ran the church's extensive outreach programs, including a home for wayward youth and a shelter for fallen women seeking redemption. The couple was featured in the Alabama Baptist Convention's monthly newsletter 6 times between 1953 and 1956, praised for their innovative ministry to society's forgotten souls. Harris's baptismal ceremonies were elaborate affairs that drew hundreds of spectators. Held monthly during the warmer months, these events featured gospel choirs, community picnics, and passionate sermons delivered from a wooden platform built over the river's edge. The pastor would wade into the water wearing white robes, his booming voice carrying across the delta as he called each candidate forward. Families would travel for days to witness their loved ones receive the Tensas blessing, as locals called it. The church maintained detailed records of every baptism performed. Martha Steele, the church secretary from 1948 to 1961, kept meticulous ledgers documenting names, ages, addresses, and next of kin for each person baptized. These records, stored in fireproof cabinets in the church basement, would later become crucial evidence in understanding the scope of what transpired at Sacred Heart Baptist. Local newspapers regularly covered the baptismal ceremonies, with the Mobile Register running feature stories about Harris's growing ministry. A 1954 article described the pastor as a man of profound faith who has brought new life to the forgotten communities of the Delta. The piece highlighted how Harris's outreach efforts had reduced crime and alcoholism in the area, citing testimonials from grateful families whose troubled relatives had found salvation. The Alabama State Police praised Harris's work with juvenile delinquents. Captain Charles Baker, who oversaw the Mobile District, wrote in a 1955 report that Sacred Heart Baptist had demonstrated remarkable success in rehabilitating young offenders through religious guidance and community service. The report noted that recidivism rates among youth who participated in Harris's programs were nearly 30% lower than the state average. Harris cultivated relationships with influential figures throughout. Governor James Franklin attended a baptismal ceremony in 1956, publicly endorsing the pastor's vital work in moral education. State legislators regularly visited the church, and Harris was invited to deliver the opening prayer at the Alabama legislature's spring session. His political connections extended to law enforcement, with Sheriff Robert Anderson of Baldwin County serving on the church's Board of Trustees from 1954 to 1962. The church's financial records showed steady growth throughout the 1950s. Donations increased from $8,400 in 1951 to over $34,000 by 1958, an extraordinary sum for a rural congregation. Much of this money came from special gifts donated by families of baptism candidates, particularly those seeking religious intervention for troubled relatives. Harris encouraged such donations, claiming they demonstrated the family's commitment to their loved one's spiritual transformation. Sacred Heart Baptist's reputation extended beyond Alabama's borders. Religious publications in Georgia, Mississippi, and Tennessee featured articles about Harris's innovative ministry. The Southern Baptist Convention invited him to speak at their 1959 annual meeting in Louisville, where he delivered a presentation titled River Baptism, Ancient Tradition for Modern Salvation. The speech was later published in the denomination's Theological Journal and distributed to seminaries across the South. The church operated several ancillary programs that enhanced its community standing. The Sacred Heart Youth Camp, established in 1953, provided summer programs for children from troubled homes. The facility, located on 200 acres of church-owned land along the river, housed up to 60 youths at a time. Parents often sent difficult children to the camp with the understanding that Harris's intensive religious programming would address behavioral problems that traditional methods had failed to correct. Harris also established the New Life Home for unwed mothers and reformed prostitutes. The facility, housed in a converted plantation mansion 5 miles from the main church, provided shelter and religious instruction for women seeking to escape lives of sin. The home typically housed 15-20 women at any given time, many of them referred by law enforcement agencies or social services departments. Residents were required to participate in intensive Bible study, manual labor, and ultimately baptism in the Tensor River as a symbol of their complete spiritual rebirth. The pastor's influence extended to the educational system. He served on the Baldwin County School Board from 1956, advocating for expanded religious education in public schools. Several teachers at local schools were members of Sacred Heart Baptist, and Harris regularly visited classrooms to deliver moral education lectures. His character-building curriculum was adopted by 6 school districts across southern Alabama. Local medical professionals also endorsed Harris's work. Dr. Eugene Hoffman, who operated a clinic in nearby Spanish Fort, frequently referred patients suffering from moral ailments to the church's counseling program. In a 1957 letter to the Alabama Medical Association, Dr. Hoffman wrote that Harris had achieved remarkable success in treating conditions that traditional medicine cannot address, specifically citing cases of alcoholism, sexual deviance, and juvenile delinquency. The church's board of trustees included some of the region's most prominent citizens. In addition to Sheriff Anderson, the board featured timber magnate Raymond Elliott, mobile banker Carl Bennett, and retired federal judge Harold Price. These men provided not only financial support, but also political protection for Harris's expansion. Their presence on the board lent credibility to the church's operations and helped deflect any potential criticism of Harris's unconventional methods. By 1960, Sacred Heart Baptist had become a model for rural ministry throughout the Deep South. Harris's combination of traditional Baptist theology with innovative outreach programs had created what religious scholars termed a total community transformation. Crime rates in the surrounding area had dropped significantly, property values had increased, and the region's reputation had improved from a backwater known for poverty and violence to a showcase of Christian redemption. The church's success attracted attention from national religious. The Home Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention designated Sacred Heart Baptist as a model congregation in 1961, recommending it as a template for rural ministry development. Harris was invited to consult with churches in Texas, Arkansas, and North Carolina, sharing his methods for community outreach and spiritual transformation. Yet beneath this veneer of Christian success, disturbing patterns were beginning to emerge that would eventually expose the horrific reality behind Harris's celebrated ministry. Ignored signs. The first documented concern about Sacred Heart Baptist's operations appeared in a 1954 letter from Mrs. Helen Brooks to the Baldwin County Sheriff's Department. Her 17-year-old son, Carl Brooks, had been sent to the church's youth camp in June of that year after repeated arrests for petty theft. According to the letter, preserved in the county archives, Carl had written to his mother describing strange happenings at the camp and begging to come home. When Mrs. Brooks arrived at the facility in late July, she was told that Carl had been baptized the previous week and had subsequently moved on to begin his new life in Christ. Church officials provided no forwarding address and claimed they had no obligation to inform parents when their children chose to leave after receiving salvation. Sheriff Robert Anderson's response to Mrs. Brooks's complaint, found in a 1979 file review, dismissed her concerns as those of an overprotective mother who fails to understand that her son has found a better path. The letter noted that Anderson had personally vouched for Pastor Harris's character and that the church operated under full authority of the Southern Baptist Convention. No investigation was conducted, and the case file was marked closed without action. Similar complaints began accumulating throughout the mid-1950s, though they were scattered across multiple jurisdictions and agencies, preventing anyone from recognizing the emerging pattern. The Alabama Department of Social Services received at least 12 reports between 1955 from families whose relatives had vanished after participating in Sacred Heart Baptist's programs. Marie Douglas, a social worker stationed in Mobile, noted in her 1958 annual report that several families have expressed concern about the whereabouts of relatives last seen at religious ceremonies in Baldwin County. However, since the individuals were all adults who had supposedly chosen to leave voluntarily, the department took no action. Dr. Albert Fisher, the Baldwin County coroner from 1951 to 1967, recorded an unusual number of drowning deaths in the Tensas River during Harris's tenure. His logs, discovered during the 1979, showed that between 1952 and 1965, 43 bodies were recovered from the river system, an average of more than 3 per year. This represented a 340% increase over the previous decade. Dr. Fisher's notes indicate that many of these bodies showed signs of prolonged submersion and were often missing identification. In 17 cases, no missing person reports had been filed, leading Fisher to classify them as transient drownings. What made these deaths particularly suspicious was their timing. Analysis of Dr. Fisher's records revealed that 68% of the drowning recoveries occurred within 2 weeks of Sacred Heart Baptist's monthly baptismal ceremonies. The correlation was so strong that local fishermen began avoiding certain sections of the river during baptism season. Yet Dr. Fisher, who was a long-time member of Harris's congregation and served as the church's volunteer medical advisor, never noted this pattern in his official reports. The most detailed early warning came from Alice Norton, a former teacher at the New Life Home, who worked there from March 1956 to September 1950. In a letter to her sister in Georgia, dated October 15, 1957, Norton described increasingly disturbing conditions at the facility. The letter, found among Norton's personal effects after her death in 1960, detailed how residents were subjected to intensive spiritual preparation that included prolonged fasting, isolation, and what she termed submission training. Norton wrote that many women who completed the program and were scheduled for baptism simply disappeared, with Harris claiming they had been called to serve in distant missions. Norton's letter also described the presence of unmarked graves on the property behind the New Life Home. She wrote that when she asked Harris about the graves, he explained they contained the remains of fallen angels who failed to achieve redemption. Norton noted that the number of graves seemed to increase regularly and that she was forbidden from approaching the area. Her letter concluded with the statement that she was leaving Alabama immediately because she feared for her safety and believed that Harris was not a man of God, but something far more sinister. The Mobile Register received an anonymous tip in January 1958 that would later prove significant. The caller, whose identity was never determined, claimed that Sacred Heart Baptist was operating a disposal service for unwanted family members. According to the tip, families throughout the region were paying Harris to permanently remove problem relatives through bogus religious programs. The caller provided specific names and dates, including several individuals who had supposedly drowned accidentally in the Tensor River. Reporter Ernest Chapman was assigned to investigate the tip, but his initial inquiries were stonewalled by church officials and local law enforcement. After Sheriff Anderson warned him about attacking a respected religious institution, Chapman was reassigned to cover county politics, and the story was dropped. Federal authorities received their first indication of problems at Sacred Heart Baptist through an unlikely source, the Internal Revenue Service. During a routine audit of the church's tax-exempt status in 1959, IRS agent Frank Reynolds discovered significant discrepancies in the organization's financial records. The church was collecting substantial donations from families whose members participated, but there was no corresponding increase in operations. Reynolds noted that the church claimed to be supporting dozens of former members who had moved on to missionary work, yet provided no documentation. Reynolds' investigation revealed that Sacred Heart Baptist was receiving an average of $2,800 per baptism candidate, an enormous sum for rural Alabama in the 1950s. These payments were recorded as voluntary contributions and were typically made just before the baptismal ceremony. However, Reynolds could find no evidence that the money was being used for its stated purpose of supporting the baptized individuals in their new lives. When he requested to interview some of these supposed missionaries, Harris provided only post office box addresses in distant cities, all of which proved to be inactive or non-existent. The IRS agent's suspicions deepened when he discovered that several prominent Alabama families had made multiple payments to the church for different family members. The Coleman family of Montgomery had paid for the spiritual rehabilitation of 4 different relatives between 1955 and 1958, each of whom had subsequently vanished after baptism. The Harper family of Birmingham had made similar payments for 3 family members. When Reynolds contacted these families, they were reluctant to discuss their dealings with the church, with several family members stating they believed their relatives were better off in their new lives and did not wish to be contacted. Perhaps most disturbing was Reynolds' discovery that several local law enforcement officials were receiving regular payments from Sacred Heart Baptist. Sheriff Anderson received a monthly consulting fee of $400 for security services, while Baldwin County Judge Thomas Lambert received $200 monthly for legal guidance. These payments, documented in the church's financial records, created clear conflicts of interest that helped explain why complaints about the church were routinely dismissed. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation received a formal complaint in 1960 from retired Army Colonel Samuel Warren, whose nephew had disappeared after attending the church's youth camp. Warren, a decorated World War I Nazi veteran with connections throughout the state government, demanded a formal investigation into the church's operations. His complaint, filed directly with the Bureau's director, detailed his nephew's disappearance and provided names of other families who had experienced similar losses. Warren's military background and political connections meant his complaint could not be easily dismissed. However, the investigation that followed was superficial and appeared designed to protect the church rather than uncover the truth. The lead investigator, Agent Roy Fletcher, was a member of a Baptist church in Montgomery and had previously attended one of Harris's speaking engagements. Fletcher's report, completed after just 3 weeks of investigation, concluded that Sacred Heart Baptist was operating within the bounds of religious freedom and that the missing individuals had chosen to begin new lives in accordance with their spiritual convictions. The report noted that Harris had provided satisfactory explanations for all questioned activities and that complaints appeared to stem from family members who failed to understand the commitment required for true spiritual transformation. By 1961, a pattern had clearly emerged, but it remained scattered across different agencies and jurisdictions. Families throughout Alabama and neighboring states were losing relatives to Sacred Heart Baptist's programs. Substantial sums of money were changing hands, and local authorities were actively discouraging investigations. Yet the church's reputation continued to grow, and Harris's political connections remained strong enough to deflect serious scrutiny. The most chilling early warning came from Dorothy Hayes, a nurse who worked part-time at the church's medical clinic in 1962. In her private diary, excerpts of which Hayes documented her growing suspicions about the church's true activities. She wrote about being asked to prepare sedation doses, ostensibly to calm their nerves before the... She also noted that Harris frequently requested detailed medical information about candidates, including blood type, known allergies, and existing health conditions. Hayes's diary entries from 1961 revealed her discovery of a hidden room beneath the church's medical clinic. She described finding medical equipment that seemed inappropriate for a simple church clinic, including surgical instruments, anesthesia apparatus, and what appeared to be an embalming table. When she questioned Harris about the equipment, he claimed it was donated surplus that the church was storing for a mission hospital in South America. Hayes noted that the equipment never seemed to be shipped anywhere, and that Harris became increasingly hostile when she asked about it. The final entry in Hayes's diary, dated March 3, 1962, stated that she had seen too much to remain silent and was planning to contact state authorities. She wrote that she had discovered detailed medical files on hundreds of individuals who had supposedly left the area after baptism, and that many of these files contained disturbing notes about post-mortem procedures and disposal protocols. Hayes never made contact with authorities. She was found dead in her apartment on March 7, 1962, with the cause of death listed as accidental drug overdose. Her diary was discovered hidden in her attic and would remain unread until 1979. Horror uncovered. The first crack in William Harris's carefully constructed facade came from an unexpected source, a damaged culvert pipe beneath the Sacred Heart Baptist Church. In September 1978, heavy rains from Hurricane Carmen caused severe flooding throughout the Mobile Bay region. When county maintenance crews arrived to repair storm damage at the church property, worker Joseph Carter noticed an unusual smell emanating from beneath the building's foundation. What he initially assumed was a sewage leak led to the discovery of a concrete chamber that would expose nearly 3 decades of systematic murder. The chamber, accessed through a hidden entrance behind the church's baptism, contained what investigators would later describe as an industrial-scale body processing facility. The room measured approximately 20 by 30 feet and was equipped with drainage systems, surgical tables, and specialized equipment for dismembering and disposing of human remains. Most horrifying were the detailed records Harris had kept, documenting every aspect of his operation with meticulous precision. Detective Lieutenant George Mitchell of the Alabama Bureau of Investigation led the initial response team. His crime scene report, filed October 3, 1978, described finding over 300 pounds of human bone fragments scattered throughout the chamber's drainage system. The bones showed clear evidence of systematic dismemberment and chemical analysis revealed traces of industrial solvents used to accelerate decomposition. Mitchell noted that the facility appeared to have been in continuous operation for decades, with newer equipment layered over older installations. The discovery of Harris's personal records provided the most damning evidence of the scope of his crimes. Hidden in waterproof containers buried beneath the baptismal platform, investigators found detailed files on each of the records, maintained with obsessive precision, included photographs, medical information, family financial data, and what Harris termed processing schedules. Each file was marked with a date of arrival, a date of spiritual transformation, and disposal method. Harris's records revealed a sophisticated selection process for choosing victims. He specifically targeted individuals from troubled backgrounds whose disappearances would be less likely to generate sustained investigation. Runaway teenagers, drug addicts, prostitutes, and mentally ill individuals made up the majority of his victims. Many were referred to the church by family members seeking religious intervention for behavioral problems, creating a perfect cover for their eventual disappearance. The financial records painted an equally disturbing picture of Harris's operation. Families typically paid between $1,500 and for their relatives' spiritual rehabilitation, with the understanding that the individual would begin a new life after it. Harris encouraged families to believe that contact with their transformed relatives would interfere with the spiritual process, effectively eliminating any expectation of future. The church collected an estimated $680,000 from victim families between 1952 and 19, equivalent to over $3 million in modern. The investigation revealed Harris's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and his ability to exploit religious faith for murderous purposes. His files contained detailed personality profiles of each victim, noting their fears, desires, and psychological vulnerabilities. He used this information to create personalized religious experiences that left victims completely trusting and compliant. Many victims actually looked forward to their baptismal ceremonies, viewing them as the culmination of their spiritual journey rather than their death sentence. Survivor testimony provided crucial insights into Harris's methods. Margaret Wells, who escaped from the New Life home in 1963 after witnessing another resident's murder, came forward after news of the discovery broke. Wells, then living under an assumed name in California, described how Harris used a combination of drugs, psychological manipulation, and religious conditioning to prepare victims for death. She testified that residents were gradually isolated from outside, subjected to intensive indoctrination, and finally told that their baptism would transport them to immediate eternal life. Wells's account of the actual murder process was particularly chilling. She described how victims were given powerful sedatives disguised as spiritual preparation medication before being led to the baptismal chamber. Harris would perform an elaborate ceremony while the victim was conscious but heavily drugged, explaining that they were about to experience true rebirth in Christ. The victim would then be held underwater until death occurred, with Harris claiming throughout the process that this was the moment of their spiritual transformation. The medical evidence corroborated Wells's testimony. Dr. Harold Price, the forensic pathologist who examined the recovered remains, found traces of barbiturates and other sedatives in bone samples. His analysis indicated that victims were likely conscious but severely impaired, experiencing what he described as a horrific combination of religious ecstasy and mortal terror. The drug combinations Harris used were specifically chosen to maintain consciousness while preventing effective resistance. Investigation of the church's property revealed additional evidence of Harris's crimes. Ground-penetrating radar identified over 200 anomalous areas in the soil around the church buildings, suggesting the presence of buried remains. Excavation of 12 test sites confirmed human remains, with some burial sites containing multiple bodies. The remains showed evidence of systematic dismemberment and were often mixed with lime to accelerate decomposition. The discovery of Harris's photographic documentation provided the most disturbing evidence of his crimes. Hidden in a sealed vault beneath his residence, investigators found over 4,000 photographs documenting various stages of his victims' experiences at the church. The images showed victims arriving hopeful and eager for spiritual transformation, progressing through various stages of indoctrination, and finally documented their actual death. During bogus baptismal ceremonies, Harris had apparently photographed each murder, creating a trophy collection that spanned nearly 3 decades. Audio recordings found at the scene revealed Harris's own commentary on his crimes. Using a dictation device, he had recorded detailed observations about each victim's psychological state, their resistance to the killing process, and his own emotional response. In one particularly chilling recording from 1967, Harris described the spiritual satisfaction he derived from sending souls directly to their eternal judgment, and expressed his belief that he was performing God's work by eliminating society's moral failures. The investigation also uncovered Harris's elaborate network of accomplices. Dorothy Harris, his wife, was deeply involved in serving as the primary recruiter and psychological conditioner for female victims. Church Secretary Martha Steele maintained false records and helped create the documentation that supported claims of victims relocating after baptism. Several church board members were aware of the murders and received financial compensation for their silence and assistance. Law enforcement complicity in Harris's crimes proved equally disturbing. Sheriff Robert Anderson had received detailed reports about the operation as early as 1956, but actively suppressed investigations in exchange for monthly payments from the church. Baldwin County Coroner Dr. Albert Fisher falsified cause of death determinations for victims whose bodies were occasionally discovered in the river system. State investigators who reviewed complaints about the church were either bribed or threatened into inaction. The scope of Harris's operation extended beyond Alabama's. Investigation revealed that he had established relationships with similar religious operations in Mississippi, Georgia. creating a network for exchanging victims and sharing disposal methods. Harris's records contained correspondence with at least 6 other pastors who were operating similar schemes, suggesting that Sacred Heart Baptist was part of a broader pattern of religious-based serial killing throughout the Deep South. Federal authorities eventually identified 166 confirmed victims of Harris's operation, though the true number was likely much higher. The victims ranged in age from 14 to 67, with the majority being young adults in their 20s and 30s. They came from across the southeastern United States, with some traveling from as far as Texas and Virginia, seeking Harris's supposed spiritual intervention. The geographic spread of the victims had helped prevent law enforcement agencies from recognizing the pattern of disappearances. The physical evidence recovered from the church property painted a picture of industrial-scale murder. In addition to the primary processing chamber, investigators found 3 smaller killing rooms, multiple body storage areas, and an elaborate drainage system that channeled liquid remains directly into the tensor. The facility had been continuously upgraded over the years, with Harris investing his profits in more efficient killing and disposal methods. Legacy and silence. William Harris was never prosecuted for his crimes. On October 15, 1978, 3 days after investigators discovered the processing chamber at his church, Harris was found dead in his cell at the Baldwin County Jail. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by hanging, but the circumstances surrounding his death raised immediate questions about the thoroughness of the investigation and the commitment of local authorities to pursuing justice. The timing of Harris's death was particularly suspicious, given that he had been cooperating with investigators and providing detailed information about his accomplices and methods. Detective Lieutenant George Mitchell reported that Harris seemed eager to confess and had been providing investigators with information that would have led to additional arrests and prosecutions. Harris's sudden death effectively ended any possibility of uncovering the full extent of the conspiracy that had enabled his crimes for nearly. Dorothy Harris, the pastor's wife and primary accomplice, disappeared from Mobile General Hospital on October 17, while being treated for what doctors described as a nervous breakdown following her husband's death. Hospital security footage showed her leaving through a service entrance at approximately 3:30 a.m., but no effort was made to locate her until nearly 48 hours later. Despite a nationwide manhunt, Dorothy Harris was never found, and many investigators believed she had been helped to escape by powerful figures who feared what she might reveal about their involvement in the church's operations. The investigation into Sacred Heart Baptist Church was abruptly terminated on November 30, 1978, just 6 weeks after the initial discovery. Alabama Attorney General Edward Collins announced that the case was due to the death of the primary suspect and insufficient evidence to pursue additional prosecutions. This decision came despite clear evidence of extensive accomplice involvement and documented law enforcement. Collins's announcement was met with outrage from victim families and criticism from federal investigators who believed the state was actively covering up the full scope of the crimes. Sheriff Robert Anderson, who had received monthly payments from Harris and actively suppressed investigations, faced no criminal charges. Instead, he announced his retirement in December 1978, citing health concerns. Anderson's pension was approved without question, and he relocated to Florida, where he died in 1983. His personal papers, which might have contained evidence of his involvement in the cover-up, were reportedly destroyed in a house fire shortly after his death. The physical evidence from the church property began disappearing almost immediately after the investigation was terminated. The underground processing chamber was filled with concrete in January 1979, officially for public safety reasons, but effectively destroying any remaining forensic evidence. The church building itself was demolished in March 1970, with Baldwin County officials claiming it posed a structural hazard. The demolition was completed in a single day, with debris immediately transported to an undisclosed location and buried. Dr. Albert Fisher, the Baldwin County coroner who had falsified death records for years, was allowed to retire quietly in February 1979. His official records from the period were transferred to state archives, but were subsequently lost during what officials described as a clerical error. Fisher moved to Arizona and died in 1987, taking his knowledge of the cover-up to his grave. His replacement as coroner, Dr. James Franklin, discovered that most medical records from the 1950s and 1960s had been destroyed in what was described as a routine records disposal. The survivors who came forward to testify about their experiences at Sacred Heart Baptist faced harassment and intimidation that effectively silenced them. Margaret Wells, who had provided crucial testimony about Harris's methods, received death threats and was forced to relocate multiple times. Her credibility was systematically attacked by local media, with newspapers describing her as a troubled woman seeking attention through false accusations. Wells eventually stopped speaking to investigators and retreated into anonymity, refusing all further contact with authorities or journalists. Federal investigators attempted to pursue the case independently, but were blocked at every turn by state and local officials. FBI agent Carl Bennett, who had been assigned to investigate the multi-state aspects of Harris's operation, found his access to evidence restricted and his requests for interviews denied. Bennett's superiors eventually reassigned him to other cases, citing lack of cooperation from local authorities as the reason for discontinuing the federal investigation. The files and records recovered from Harris's operation faced a similar fate. While investigators had initially catalogued over 4,000 photographs and hundreds of hours of audio recordings documenting the crimes, these materials began disappearing from evidence storage. By 1980, less than 10% of the original evidence remained, with officials claiming that most materials had been lost or destroyed due to improper storage conditions. The remaining evidence was classified and sealed, with access restricted for ongoing investigation purposes that never materialized. The church's extensive property holdings were quickly liquidated through a series of questionable transactions. The 200-acre youth camp was sold to a development company for a fraction of its assessed value, with the buyer having documented ties to several of Harris's former political allies. The New Life Home property was purchased by a shell corporation that immediately demolished all buildings and converted the land to agricultural. The unmarked graves behind the facility were never excavated, and the site was planted with soybeans the following spring. Victim families found themselves unable to pursue civil remedies or even obtain official acknowledgement of their losses. The church's assets had been transferred to a series of shell corporations shortly before Harris's arrest, effectively placing them beyond legal reach. Insurance companies denied claims related to the victims, arguing that their deaths could not be confirmed due to the lack of recovered remains. Most families were left with no legal recourse and no official recognition that their loved ones had been murdered. The broader network of accomplices and connected religious operations that Harris had documented was never investigated. His records had identified at least 6 other pastors operating similar schemes throughout the Southeast, but these leads were never pursued. Several of these individuals continued operating their churches for years after Harris's death, suggesting that the systematic murder of vulnerable individuals through religious manipulation continued unabated in other locations. Local media coverage of the case was heavily influenced by the same political and religious networks that had protected Harris during his active years. The Mobile Register, which had previously featured glowing articles about the pastor's ministry, published only brief reports about the discovery and quickly moved to characterize the crimes as the isolated actions of a single disturbed individual. Editorial coverage emphasized the need to move past this unfortunate incident and avoid damaging the reputation of legitimate religious institutions. The psychological impact on the surrounding community was profound and lasting. Many residents who had supported Harris's ministry or sent family members to his programs struggled with guilt and trauma. Several suicides occurred in the months following the discovery, including individuals who had served on the church's board of trustees or had otherwise been involved in its operations. The community's trust in religious and governmental institutions was severely damaged, contributing to a culture of suspicion and silence that persisted for decades. Efforts to memorialize the victims or acknowledge the scope of the crimes were systematically blocked. Proposals for a memorial at the church site were rejected by Baldwin County officials, who argued that such recognition would be inappropriate and potentially harmful to community healing. Victim families who attempted to organize remembrance services faced harassment and legal challenges. The absence of official acknowledgement meant that the 166 confirmed victims of Harris's operation remained largely forgotten by history. By 1985, most of the key figures involved in the case were either dead or had relocated far from Alabama. The few survivors who had testified about their experiences had been effectively silenced through intimidation or had chosen to retreat into anonymity. The physical evidence had been destroyed or hidden, and the official records had been sealed or lost. The systematic murder of 166 people over 26 years had been successfully covered up, with only fragmentary evidence remaining to document one of the most extensive serial killing operations in America. The legacy of Sacred Heart Baptist Church serves as a chilling reminder of how religious authority, political corruption, and societal indifference can combine to enable massive crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. The victims, predominantly young people seeking spiritual guidance or family members trying to help troubled relatives, were betrayed by the very institutions that claim to offer salvation, and their deaths were compounded by a systematic cover-up that denied them justice and prevented future victims from being warned about similar operations. Today, the site where Sacred Heart Baptist Church once stood is an empty field, with no marker to indicate the horror that occurred there. The Tensor River continues to flow past the location, carrying its secrets toward Mobile Bay. Local residents rarely speak of what happened, and many younger people in the area have never heard of William Harris or his crimes. The silence that protected the perpetrators during their active years has evolved into a collective amnesia that ensures their victims remain forgotten, and their methods remain available to future predators who understand the power of religious manipulation and institutional protection. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering